Now, on to other news. The first resignation from Labour's front bench over the party's stance on Israel's invasion into Gaza has been submitted. This is Shadow Minister Imran Hussain stepping down overnight, saying his view on the conflict differed substantially to the position adopted by Sir Keir Starmer.
Well, joining us now is former Labour advisor Richard Power Sayeed. Richard, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. Do you think this could be the beginning of more resignations from Starmer's front bench?
Well, look, I really hope not. Imran's a great guy, but, I don't think people are necessarily going to follow his lead just because he's doing something. I think that lots of people in the Labour Party realise that the leadership's been on a bit of a journey with this. I think they've got to a much better place. They're also in a really difficult situation, right? Because people are asking for them to demand a ceasefire. We all know that a ceasefire is not going to happen. And the leader of the opposition isn't really there to ask for impossible things. If other people want to do that, if they want to do that kind of campaigning politics, then I think they've got the right to do that. And that's why Imran's stepping down from the front bench. But Keir's in a position where he's saying, I want to be Prime Minister in a few months, in a year's time. He's got to be demanding things which are possible. And that's what a humanitarian pause might just be.
But it does play back into that divide within the Labour Party on these kind of issues. We know that he may well be the first frontbencher. We're told there could be others, but there's been many councillors, Labour councillors, that have stepped down.
Well, look, it's obviously really, it's really disappointing when we lose control of a council because councillors have decided to leave the Labour whip or even the party. But ultimately, that's not the thing that's going to decide whether Labour wins the next election or not. It's incredibly important for Keir Starmer to project an image of confidence, of strength, of seriousness, and I think that's what he's continuing to do.
Even if he doesn't believe it?
Like what?
Do you think Keir Starmer's position on the... Would he have called for a ceasefire 5 years ago, do you think?
That's an interesting question. I have no idea, is the short answer, but I think that 5 years ago...
The smart money says he would have done. He
well,
would have been calling for this and shouting from the rooftops if he wasn't facing an election.
Well, that brings me back to the point that I made before, that when you're the leader of the opposition and you want to be Prime Minister very soon, then you've got to do a different kind of politics, right? And the politics of we're demanding a ceasefire. I'd like there to be a ceasefire, right? But I don't think it's going to happen. And I think that the leader of the opposition has a responsibility to make demands of what's possible. It's not campaigning politics where you just say something that's ideal. It's a kind of pragmatic politics where you say, I think maybe we can persuade Netanyahu to go for a humanitarian pause. And therefore, that's what we're going to ask him to do.
And what do you make of Keir Starmer's response to people who are calling for that idealistic response, i.e. the ceasefire? You know, he doesn't seem to have come out and been particularly supportive. Obviously, he doesn't have to adopt that position himself. But what do you think of the way he's approached these protests?
Well, I guess there's the protests on the one hand, which, have been marred by the fact there have been some really unpleasant people involved with them, which is incredibly disappointing because I think the vast majority of people at those protests, they believe in peace and, OK, I don't think a ceasefire is possible, and I think most of them do, but ultimately they're good people who just want peace. That's what most people in those protests are involved with. But because some very unpleasant anti-Semites have marred those protests, I think it creates a situation where, the leader of the opposition has to put some significant distance between himself and those protests. I actually think that generally Keir's been incredibly pragmatic about this. He said there's a diversity of opinion in the Labour Party on the Labour front bench, and so he's been very open-minded about letting people be a bit more flexible with the stance they take publicly, which is why I don't think Imran needed to step down, to be quite honest. I think he was given a lot of flexibility by the leader of the opposition, and that was a very open-minded, pragmatic thing to do.
Who's next?
There are all sorts of rumours. I'm hoping none of them.
You know, Richard, come on, you know the story behind the scenes. You give us some names. Who do you think, by the end of this week, will Naz Shah still be serving Sir Keir Starmer?
I would be really disappointed if not. I think there's lots of talented people on the front bench, and when you've got a leader who's giving you that kind of flexibility, you've had all sorts of people throughout the party saying, we've got different opinions, but that's OK, we're a broad church. That's what the Labour Party's supposed to be.
Moving on now to the King's speech yesterday. I don't know if you saw the image of Rishi Sunak sat in the Commons when Keir Starmer was debating the speech, and they were talking about Suella Braverman, the fact that she's not fit to be Home Secretary. He seemed extremely defeated. In fact, all 7 of them on the front bench looked like they'd already given up.
I think that the King's speech was an act of giving up, right? Everybody looked at this and they were like, this is what you've got?
Wow.
You know, like, come on. The party conference, T levels, new things for A levels, ban on smoking. Like, that's not how you win an election, right? OK, so that didn't really work out. Maybe the King's speech is where you're going to pull the rabbit out of the hat. Nope, nothing there. Later on, I guess you'll have Peter Cardwell telling you, giving you some analysis of the day. He will very reasonably say that political watchers are looking for what happens in the autumn statement. That's when the big stuff is going to happen, right? But the point is that if you're 20 points behind Keir Starmer, as Rishi Sunak is, you've got to be pulling it out of the bag every single time. King's speech is one of these big moments in politics where you've got to show people, I'm on your side. I've got some solutions to the cost of living crisis. Rishi Sunak was almost actively saying to everyone, we've got nothing. We're just waiting to see what happens with inflation. We don't have any control of that because actually Putin's in charge. It's really sad.
I mean, it could well be, Richard, that you're right, they're waiting for the autumn statement, and they think, despite the front pages, lots of lovely pictures of the King and the Queen, etc., it gets that kind of coverage. But the detail, I don't know how much that penetrates the public, but maybe the autumn statement talks about tax cuts, talks about the real nuts and bolts of the economy, may well be the thing that garners the greater headlines. And that's the bit they're banking on. And I'm giving them a massive benefit of the doubt.
You're being very generous there. Yeah. Well, look, I think the point is, it's not that there cannot be anything in the autumn statement that is politically useful to them. It's that when you're 20 points behind, you need to use every opportunity you've got as Prime Minister to bring it back. And he's not doing that because he doesn't have the goods. He's just waiting to see what happens on inflation. He's banking on that. Firstly, it's probably not going to work out. It looks like inflation and employment are going to continue being in the wrong kind of place for winning an election for Sunak. But secondly, more importantly, he's just not doing anything to try. You know, like Labour have been saying, for instance, like last year with the cost of living crisis, let's have support with energy bills. Let's have a windfall tax. Leading the conversation on that. A couple of months ago, Rachel Reeves had this fantastic 5-point plan for helping people with their mortgages, saying to lenders, you've got to give people temporary going on to interest rate only mortgages. For instance, Labour's leading that conversation on cost of living, and then you've got a King's speech where the Prime Minister doesn't say anything about it.
But you can't light a cigarette.
Not if you're 14.
There's the big headline.
Well, thanks to Richard Power Sayeed. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.